Hello, welcome back to the Everything is Black and White podcast. I'm Andrew Musgrove, joined by Mark Quillers. As you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, not in the studio today with the Champions League game against Benfica tomorrow. It's all a little bit chaotic, although a lot more stressful at home because I'm having fun with the internet because it doesn't want to work. But hopefully, we'll make it through this episode without it jumping or going offline because me and Mark have got lots of wonderful analysis to bring you of Newcastle United's 2-1 defeat to Brighton down at the Amex. As always, sponsored by NordVPN. That's the show, not Newcastle United's defeat. Do click the link in the podcast description box to get a discount on your NordVPN plan. Thanks, Nord, for the support, and thanks to you guys for signing up and staying safe online and supporting the podcast. Mark, welcome back. You well? You good?
I am good. Certainly plenty to analyse after a disappointing day on the south coast that we're kind of become accustomed to these days.
Yeah, I mean, when you expect it, it doesn't hurt as much, right?
Pretty much. I mean, there's always hurt there, isn't there? Because you always expect a little bit more, and I think Saturday has left us probably with more questions than answers. More questions than answers, I should say, about where Newcastle are at right now.
Yes, indeed. There's lots of key talking points. We'll just run through quickly what happened. Not that you guys need reminding. Of course, Newcastle, as I said, lost 2-1 to Brighton. 2 goals from Danny Welbeck and a wonderful flick from Nick Voldemort was Newcastle United's goal. That was the equaliser, but then Welbeck got the winner shortly after. I mean, I want to start first off, Mark, by talking about Newcastle United on the road because there is a real issue here. You haven't won since April the 7th, and that was a win against Leicester City. Now, of course, there has been the summer break and what have you, but it's no wins in 7. They also struggle against any side above 13th, which is not a record you want to be having. I mean, what is it about Newcastle on the road which you think is causing them so much trouble?
I think partly this season, it's possibly that they need to freshen up a little bit in key moments in the season. I mean, you look at, I know we'll discuss the midfield in a moment, but you look at players come back from international duty. I think maybe there needs to be a thought process along, or certainly thought given to maybe rotation to bring in fresher players. I think also Newcastle maybe struggle to break down sides on the road because they will, at times look to sit in and kind of absorb any pressure Newcastle put on, whereas Newcastle's natural instinct when they're heading out seems to be to play on a counter-attack, which obviously if someone's sitting in, you can't play on that counter-attack. But I think most of all this season, I think it's just a lack of composure on the ball, a lack of poor decision making. I don't think there's necessarily one key factor. I think it's just everything just hasn't come together on the road. But I still don't feel, barring the odd spark, whether home or away, Newcastle have quite hit the levels we'd expect this season. I think they are still kind of trying to find that kind of perfect match across the side, not just in midfield. But it kind of reminds me of the last Champions League season where everything just felt a little bit disjointed, and I don't feel as if Newcastle found a pattern to the game until maybe the latter part of the season. So, yeah, it all feels a little bit mixed thinking at the moment, I guess you could say.
And that last campaign in the Champions League is when Newcastle went on that barren run of wins on the road. It's difficult for Eddie Howe, isn't it? Because he wants to play his strongest side, and that is Sandro Tonali, Bruno Gomes, and Joelinton. But also, they've all been on international duty. 2 of them have had huge miles of travel. And maybe in hindsight, he would admit that he got the team selection wrong. As much as you want to play your best players, he is dealing with them having been away on international duty. And it leads us into another key question, because for months, Mark, you and I have both said that Newcastle United have the best midfield 3 in the Premier League. So how are we sitting here about to criticise their performance and, at least for me, sadly suggest that Joelinton is taken out of the side for the next few games? Is it an overreaction? Is it just one game? Is it a little bit of everything? Or were we wrong?
No, I don't think we were. I think it's firstly what we should say is that Newcastle and Eddie Howe in particular will have had all of the stats based on recovery before he's made his team selection for Saturday. I just think when they play teams like Bournemouth as well, or Brighton, who have energetic midfields, who have progressive midfields, Newcastle needs someone maybe just a little bit more disciplined in there, and certainly needs someone with a little bit more comfort in the ball. Now, I think we spoke last week, funny enough, about the fact that Joelinton has improved that side of his game. We spoke, it was 2 weeks ago, sorry, we spoke about that after the Forest win. But I just feel as if there's a need for more discipline in there. Now, we know Sandro Tonali can do that role and has been unbelievable in that role. But I feel like when they go to places like Brighton and Bournemouth, where I feel like Eddie Howe hasn't quite got the found the right mix to take on what Hurzeler and what Raiola bring in midfield and their style of play. So I just felt there was maybe a need to freshen it up in there with, as I say, certainly more energy, certainly a player that maybe hadn't been on international duty, and someone who can command the ball a bit easier and kind of move the ball on a bit easier. But the big thing for me from Saturday that I noticed was Brighton's midfielders were continually running up beyond Newcastle's midfield. And it was, look, the defence has taken a lot of stake, and I do think there is some merit in that because, particularly the first goal, Welbeck's just got in far too easily behind Botman and Chow, which is just not good enough defensively. But then at the same time, you look at the midfield, and they've all been bypassed by Brighton's midfield. So there is, I think, a need, and I'm not sure Newcastle have that player in the midfield options, if I'm being perfectly honest. There is a need for someone who's just going to sit a little bit and just protect when they come under pressure in key moments in away games. And that may be even more so in the Champions League as well. So I think, although you look at the midfield options and we're very fortunate to have what we have, I do think there may be a need at some point in the future to look at someone who maybe could do that role on a more consistent basis.
Well, I think you're correct. They don't have the personnel to really provide the solution. And even though we both have said it's the best midfield in the Premier League when it clicks, I was saying that alongside critiquing the fact that time and time again, the opposition were getting in that space behind the midfield and in front of the defence. I think I did it against Forest. I did it a couple of weeks back because it's nothing new. It's been a constant flaw, if you like, of this Eddie Howe side, not just this season, but last season as well. And it's painted over, the cracks are painted over because when that midfield clicks going forward, then Newcastle tend to win, they tend to score goals. So you're not really concerned about the twice or thrice that they got bypassed because Newcastle have won the game. But on Saturday, it didn't click. And you mentioned there the first goal, which is just one of absolute utter frustration, simply because, like you say, the midfield was just bypassed far too easily, and there has to be real questions to how that was allowed to happen. I mean, I've got the image. I'm going to put it up on the screen in a moment. But what was that, Mark?
Do we have to?
Well, we have to. Yeah, we're going to show the people who are fortunate enough to be watching on YouTube exactly what we're talking about. I mean, I'm sure they're very aware of it. I'm just waiting for it to load. Like I say, good old internet playing tricks with us. But the point being is that you mentioned Danny Welbeck scoring. So here he is. It's on the screen. You can see Danny Welbeck there in between Sven Botman and Malik Chiao. But what you have to look at first and foremost is the fact that Van Heck is allowed to advance. Rutter is already behind the midfield three. And what's even more concerning, if you look over to his left, you can see Ayari's in exactly the same position. So they've got two players to pick from, and even the number 27 is well advanced on Anthony Gordon there. It goes back though to the fact that Van Heck is allowed to advance. There's no way that he should be allowed that time and space to pick that first pass. If you're going to step out, as the midfield tends to do, then what you need is that pressure from Voldemort or Anthony Gordon applied to the centre-backs to stop them picking that initial pass, because that's the damaging pass, because it just takes out that midfield straight away. And it's now to the point whether you have to change approach, because you can't have the midfield stepping out if the press isn't there. And recently, it's not been.
No, it hasn't. And also, I mean, when you look at that, you're right that maybe Voldemort needs to come across and press. But Van Hecker, firstly, I will say it's a lovely pass. He's got the weight of it and everything perfectly. But that pass doesn't happen if he's pressed.
Yeah, he's
Now,
got the time. He's got the time
yeah,
to pick that pass.
yes. But I still think there, one of the midfielders has to drop in to protect. And really, you're looking at one of the other two to possibly be the one that will go and press Van Hecker, which would naturally on that side probably be Joelinton. But he sat kind of in his own half. I don't know if Newcastle at this phase were trying to manage the game and be a bit cute and just absorb a little bit of pressure, but it just hasn't worked. And once that ball's got through, I mean, Brighton have pretty much, I think, got a 4-on-4 and have a real, yeah, it is, well, it's 5-on-3 really when you look at that. So it's just Newcastle being opened up far too easily. I didn't really like the position Sven Botman got himself in. He's kind of got himself into a really awkward position where he can't see Welbeck. He's kind of twisting and not able to react to the ball. Chow, who we've given a lot of credit to, and rightly so, hasn't really reacted. So I don't know if there was just a lack of communication between those two, if any. But it just feels like a lot of errors. Apologies if you can hear me dog in the background. It just feels like there's a lot of errors have happened. A lot of poor errors of judgment have happened during the game or during that phase of the game, and it's led to, we know at the top level you're going to be, you are going to be punished if you do that, and it just feels like a really poor phase of the game from Newcastle. I'm sure Eddie Howe and his technical staff will be analysing that to the nth degree right now, and it is a little bit of a concern that it has happened so easily.
If Newcastle aren't able to do the press anymore, and you might argue it wasn't actually their last season as much as we'd seen the season before, because Alexander Isak didn't really do it. He was compensated by Anthony Gordon and what have you. Is a change in approach needed? Because I can't Nick Voldemort and he's banging the goals, but he's not someone who's going to press. He's just not going to do it. He tries his heart, but he's not someone who's going to press. And I just wonder, as difficult as it is, and we know Newcastle are kind of going through this transition period anyway, but do we also now have to chuck in the fact that actually we are no longer this pressing, high intensity side, and we have to quickly learn and adapt to that?
I don't think there's any need for a complete rehash of tactics here, or I think it is just minor tweaks in, not even in system, just in, maybe approach at times. They will have to maybe ease off a bit, but I don't feel like Saturday's game was one of those where they needed a massive change. I think it was one of those where, again, it comes down to key decisions and key moments, players not playing well. These things happen over a long season, and I don't think we need to get too carried away just yet about what's going on at the moment. But there will come a point if this sort of struggles in away games does continue, then maybe there will need to be a change in approach. But at the moment, for me, it's just a case of finding those little subtle changes that'll improve what's happening on the road. I look at Saturday and I think, I think you said at the very start, would a Ramsey coming in for Joelinton have made a difference, because there is a little bit more energy. He hasn't had that. Yes, he's just come back from injury, but would him starting and getting an hour and then Joelinton coming on for the last half hour have made a difference? I think Louis Miley did really well when he came on, and I know you'll joke about what I always say about Louis, but I thought there was a real positive there from his performance. So it now comes down to, does Eddie Howe trust those two to play in big games? Because at some point this season, and I think this is my main criticism of Howe in the last Champions League season, was that he didn't rotate enough. Whether it was because he didn't trust certain players, I don't know. That's obviously a question for him. But I do feel there is a need this season to be a little bit more canny with his team selection and rotation. Now, it's not, it's not something to panic over just yet. I think they will improve. But in terms of the intensity of the press, Newcastle have always been at their best when they do that. My concern, I think, would be that they tend to do it more in big games where it almost feels like they're more up for it, even though I wouldn't ever question the mentality. But if you look at the Liverpool, if you look at even Arsenal for large parts, or Barcelona, or games like that, Newcastle, when they need to press to get themselves on the front foot and use that intensity, do it really well. But then games like Bournemouth or Brighton, they haven't. So I do wonder why that is, and that could be the question to look at going forward.
One solution would be to limp through to January and then go and buy a more defensive midfielder. For me, someone like Tyler Adams, and regular listeners and viewers of the podcast know that I'm a huge fan. I advocated Newcastle to buy him when he was at Leeds, did move to the South Coast, suffered a horrendous injury, but now he's playing week in, week out, and he looks really, really good. 15 interceptions so far this season. That's third highest across the entirety of the league. He's the sort of player Newcastle United need, I think, in that position where he's just happy to sweep up. He's happy to sit and anchor in front of the defence to allow the other two midfielders, Bruno and Tonali, it would be to advance without having to worry about picking anyone up. At the moment, like we say, they're stepping forward, leaving too much space in behind. And what they need is someone to sit there and, as you said, protect the defence. But that's January. They're not going to get Tyler Adams, Bournemouth flying high, but they need a player like him to come in. If you've got any suggestions who that might be, ladies and gentlemen, the comments. It leads us on to Joelinton, because I said there, they bought Tyler Adams, for example. It would be Bruno and Tonali inside the midfield alongside him. Joelinton would be out of the team. He's not right, is he? It's a mixture of the travel and the distance he's gone over the last couple of weeks, but he's not really recovered, I don't think, from that injury that he picked up probably against Sunderland in the FA Cup all those months ago. And I think for the good of him and for the good of the team, he probably needs a few games out just to really be able to recover properly. And I know that means you will lose that kind of match fitness, but it just doesn't look right. First 5 minutes, I actually thought he was quite decent. He was involved. He was getting in the tackles. He was moving all over the shop. But he was hooked at half time, and that tells you all you need to know about his performance. I will give him a bit of a defense, though, Mark. Stats: 5 out of 7 duels won, 21 out of 26 passes made, and 8 defensive actions, which was still second highest of any Newcastle United player in the entirety of the game. So you look at the stats, paints a better picture, maybe a reason to why the question of him dropping out more long-term isn't an easy one to answer. But I go back to the fact that Eddie Howe brought him off at half-time, and that very rarely happens.
So I think we need to be, firstly, praise Eddie Howe to a degree for being proactive and trying to make that half-time sub and trying to bring around a change, because I think in the past there has been maybe a slight criticism of the timing of his subs, where he's maybe been a little bit too cautious. At least he's tried to make a change then and be proactive, as I say. But also, and there are outlets out there that will be, sensationalism and all that sort of thing, and try and be criticism for this, try and criticize for the sake of doing it. But I think with Joelinton, there is still, and I've said this a couple of weeks ago, that there's still a big part for him to play, not just in this season, but in Newcastle United going forwards. However, I think there is also an acceptance that maybe they need to pick and choose the games when he plays more. So he does need to play more when Newcastle need to go and press a team, when they need to be aggressive, when they need to stamp their authority on a game. Maybe that's his game. Whereas when they're going to have a little bit more possession, when they're going to need to unlock a defence, do they then need a Ramsey in there possibly? This is kind of the role you would have had Joe Willock 2 years ago, when he was in form and he was kind of avoiding injuries at times. He would play that sort of left-sided centre midfield role, where he would get on, he'd drive on, he would pick passes, he would try and get him behind, all that sort of stuff. And that would be maybe where I'd see Joelinton going forward, is a case of there is a need for Eddie Howe to pick and choose when he does play. And that's not a criticism. I think the one thing we need to look at from this Newcastle squad now is looking at them as a squad, because in the past we've been so used to having so few options from the bench and so few options even beyond that. But now there are options all over the park. I mean, you can argue about the striker position, but that'll be resolved. But elsewhere, they've got massive decisions to be made right across the pitch, and we need to look at Newcastle not as this is year 11. It's going to be a case of this will be year 11 for this game. And I think that's the big change that Newcastle are going through at the moment. And then the pressure comes on Howe. The pressure is really on Howe to get his team selection right every game and to use that squad and trust everyone within that squad.
Is Jacob Ramsey the answer to the Joelinton question?
It's a really difficult one to answer, that one, isn't it? Because we haven't seen enough of him, and two, he's still coming back from his injury problems of his own. But what I would say is, in the brief moments we've seen him, he gives you a lot more forward thrust and a lot more creativity than Joelinton in that kind of left-sided centre midfield role. And I think what you'll probably see as well, and I know that there's a lot of talk about Anthony Gordon's performances, but I think if he does play in that role, I think he'll dovetail quite nicely with Gordon, where Gordon can come inside and maybe get closer to Nick Voldemort if he is playing up front. And then Ramsey can naturally drift out wide, a little bit like Joelinton and Joe Willock did 2 years ago, or just over 2 years ago. So, yeah, it's really interesting. I think with Ramsey, everything I've seen from him at Aston Villa would suggest that he can do that role and do it very well. So it's probably a little bit simplistic to say, yes, that he is the solution to everything. It's far more complicated than that. We know it is. But I think I would feel comfortable with him being in that role, and kind of almost rotating with Joelinton based on whoever Newcastle play, whatever style's needed.
I think he'll start against Benfica on Tuesday. The other man who's been questioned and critiqued is Dan Burn.
Oh,
not a left back, Mark. I think that's fair to say. Tries his heart out, but in an ideal world, he would not be playing in that position. I've seen a lot of people, including many who got in touch with me on social media when I asked about what the main issue was with Newcastle at the moment, how does Eddie Howe fix it? And a lot of people came back along the lines of he needs to stop being so sentimental and he needs to make the big calls. And the way of that at Dan Burn, great story, great lad, gives his heart, but he's not a left back, and Newcastle United have been hit down that flank. Eddie Howe would say that, Dan Burn's great servant, great professional, major part of this team he is, but he also would have the right to argue, and he wouldn't do this because this is kind of throwing down on the bus, but what option have I got? I haven't got anybody else to play in that position. Lewis Hall is injured. Tino Livramento was injured. Alex Murphy is not up to scratch. Leo Shahar is a right back, and you couldn't play him there and move Trippier over because he's not ready. It goes back to that point of what option does anyhow have at left back right now? He doesn't have any option, and he's got to limp through to January until he can maybe buy another one.
I think this is just a kind of a series of unfortunate events with this left back situation. I mean, look, losing Tino Livramento was a massive blow. To lose Lewis Hall as well just compounds that. So the only other issue, or the only other option, I suppose, would be to play Emil Kraft at right back and switch Trippier to left back. But again, I think there'd be maybe questions about that. Now, Burn, because of his changing shape physically, is now more accustomed to being a left-side centre-back rather than a left-back. So naturally there is possibly a need for, if he has to play at left-back, then your focus then goes on the protection he gets. So again, we're kind of going back to the left-sided midfield role. Is the protection being given there? Is Anthony Gordon or who is playing left-hand side? Are they protecting Burn? I'm not massively sure they always are.
But if that is the case, is that not detrimental to Newcastle United? Because if one of your first instructions is potentially to Anthony Gordon or Jacob Ramsey, and it's like, you've got to sit in here and help Dan Burn out, then that's surely a negative.
No,
you're saying Dan Burn's not capable of doing it, and that's kind of reaffirmed by the fact one of your first instructions is to your left winger, make sure you're helping out.
But again, this comes down to game management, though. It's about managing yourself in certain areas of the game and certain times in the game. It's making those positive decisions. And at the moment, I just feel some of Newcastle's key players aren't making the right decisions in the right moments. Now, that can happen in any game. We shouldn't, again, be looking to be overly critical for the sake of being critical. But the simple fact of what you said before is true. Newcastle don't really have another option other than maybe Kraft and Trippier at fullback. Burn will manage them through until whenever Hall's back fit, which I think they've said is possibly the next international break. He could be approaching fitness then. Livramento maybe not too far behind. So it is a case of just trying to get through this. Now, you mentioned Alex Murphy. So obviously I've seen quite a bit of the 21s this season. I think the fact that I know he's been mentioned by Howe, but the fact he hasn't been utilised at all Yes, he's been an unused sub, I think, a couple of times, but that probably tells you a lot about where he's at right now. So I wouldn't really count that as an option. I think it would be a big ask to bring him in, to be honest. Based on what I've seen in the under 21s, I think he probably needs a loan or even a permanent move to kickstart his career. So I wouldn't class that. But I feel for Burn a bit because I think you know for a fact what you're going to get from Dan Burn, and we shouldn't forget that the second goal. I mean, it's an unbelievable challenge that he puts in, doing what any good fullback should do, which is covering his centre backs. And I understand the frustration, but I just feel it's just really unfortunate what's happened with Newcastle. Again, probably goes back to what we spoke about a while ago, isn't it? That they maybe do need another left back in the squad. That is a senior left back.
Yeah, I think obviously we're feeling a bit down in the dumps because they've lost on the road again. The season has not clicked at all for Newcastle United, but there are, reasons for that kind of out of their control. They haven't got their two first choice fullbacks. And if they had that, they'd look so much better going forward. Defensively, they're not too bad at all, but you'd feel a lot more confident with Lewis Hall at left back. So we have to consider that, although that counts for nothing at the end of the day. Points is what we're in the game for. Anthony Elanga, the other man who's coming for a lot of criticism. And I have to say, it's bordering on ludicrous, really. Look, he's not had a good start at all. Not at all. I'm not going to sit here and try and say he has or defend him at all. He hasn't, right? But remember Anthony Gordon's first few months in Newcastle United. Slow. People questioning the fact that we brought him in. Why did we need him? Signed Tonali to a degree, scored against Villa, but the conclusion of his happiness after that game was that he wanted to be back in Milan. He didn't want to be here. And then obviously he got banned. Players can take time to settle. And I know I've got a lot more riding on this than most because I stated he's going to be worth double what Newcastle paid for him. I think I got my numbers a little bit mixed up. But I still think Newcastle, when it comes to selling them, will be able to make more than what they paid for him. He's going to be a fantastic player for Newcastle United. It just hasn't worked at this moment. I think there's two reasons maybe to why it's getting more attention. A, because the other big money signing, Nick Voldemort, has hit the ground running. And that kind of then shift attention onto someone who also cost that kind of money and hasn't. And B, just because it hasn't clicked for Newcastle United, so you need that scapegoat. Almiron's gone. Longstaff's gone. So who we're going to pick on, it's going to be Elanga. Again, I'm not saying to anyone who's critiquing him that you are mistaken for doing so. He's not been very good this season. But I think there's a fine line in being critical of what he's done so far and just being downright insulting towards him. And people are writing him off already. It's absolutely crazy. And I just think if you're going to critique him, you got to do it in the right way.
But isn't it 2 weeks since we had messages about his performance against Union Saint-Gilloise, like how positive he was then? And what we do know is that players maybe at times, I know Voldemort is probably the kind of standout with this, or the exception, I should say, sorry. Players do take time to adapt to Eddie Howe's methods, Eddie Howe's way of playing, the way he wants Newcastle to play. Elanga will come good. I'm firmly confident that I've got no concerns really about it in the long term. But in the short term, it's just about him getting used to it and getting used to, like you say, like Anthony Gordon had. It was a great example. Until he scored against Chelsea on the last day of that season, there was nothing a lot positive to give, in terms of feedback for Anthony Gordon's performances. And then the following season, after he'd been away with England 21s, he absolutely flew and was arguably Newcastle's best player that season. So I think with Elanga, it's just patience. They just need to show patience. And I think he's dealing with another move in his career, the biggest move of his career, with the money involved. There's a lot of stuff going on. The Isaac situation will have impacted a big mate leaving the club on the back of his own move there. So there's a lot of stuff going on with Elanga you need to take into account. But I think the biggest one is he's just getting used to how Eddie Howe plays, the demands of an Eddie Howe side, and maybe a slightly different demands placed upon him by the manager.
Yeah, and as we said earlier, Newcastle going through a change as well. It's not just a simple drop in on that right wing and away you go. It's just not the way it is. They're trying to become a team with more control, which actually long term probably doesn't suit Anthony Elanga at all. And I don't think Voldemort's style suits him either, because Voldemort likes to be much more involved. I think someone like Johan Wissa would be perfect for Anthony Elanga because he's going to hang off the last man and he's going to be there. Now, of course, that depends on Elanga getting the ball in the box, but we saw that very early on in the season. There was them 2, 3, 4 first games. We all left the games thinking and saying, if there's a striker who isn't Anthony Gordon, we're scoring goals. So again, I think it's just kind of a mixture of a lot of things, and unfortunately, Elanga is the man people are targeting. But look, Eddie Howe, I'm going to play a clip now. He is sure that Anthony Elanga has got a bright future at Newcastle United.
We need more from everybody. It's never about one player. Anthony is going to be a great player for this football club. I've got no doubt about that. But some players need a little bit extra time and more support and a different, just something to happen positively for them to suddenly kick off. He's got all the attributes to do really well here, so I've got no issues or worries with him. It's about the team. It's always about the collective, and too many of our attacking players currently aren't delivering enough, and that's sometimes withdrawing through the team, as in looking at your centre halves and their distribution and your fullbacks, their contribution as well. So it's never about any one player.
And he's spot on. Gordon, is he producing? No. Harvey Barnes, is he producing? No. Jacob Murphy is probably the best of all 4 of them. Other than Nick Valdemade, no one's really at their best, and even Valdemade is, looking frustrated, and he's obviously scored goals, but he's not getting that many chances. But you look at the wingers, and no one's really impressing. I think it's just the big money price tag which is on the head of Elanga. That being said, I wouldn't have started him, and I know people will say, you can say that afterwards, but I wouldn't have started him. I think his mind's not right. I don't think he's in the right headspace with what's happening with his international career, and plus the attention on his domestic career. I would have started Jacob Murphy, who looked decent when he did come on at half time. It'd be interesting to see that Benfica starting 11 as well. But yeah, I think he maybe got that right wing starting position wrong. But that's easy for me to say. I'm not Eddie Howe. That's why he's the manager, and I'm not. Valdemade, great goal.
Yeah, I mean, continuing to make some people in Germany look a bit silly, isn't he? It's such a great finish. It really is, and I think it's. I remember Patrick Kluivert doing similar down at
Palace.
Palace, yes, and Jose Perez did one at West Brom, didn't he? Like that. It's just such a great finish, and it's the only way he can really get that ball goalwards, because the defender's got himself in a position where any shot that he's trying to hook around the defender is getting blocked. And I just loved it. It just shows how confident the lad is. I mean, there's never really been any doubt about his confidence or self-belief. But to try stuff like that in a pressure situation on the pitch just shows how far he's come in, even this sort of first 2 months as a Newcastle player. So, yeah, again, really excited by him. Obviously boosted by his first international goal, no matter how that came about. Obviously off his shoulder, we should say. But I love everything about him. I love his attitude. You listen to him after the game, and he always talks. I find myself constantly agreeing with whatever he's saying. He is going a long way to becoming exactly what Newcastle United need him to be, in a role that he would probably argue isn't his best, which I think is a massive boost for Eddie Howe. I still think Newcastle haven't got the best out of him. I still think that will come further down the line. But if he's doing what he's doing now, when he's maybe at 75% of what he can be, then it's very exciting for the future. And I think it's another big money addition that is going to hopefully pay off for Newcastle right now.
Yeah, great foundation for him to build on. Come on then, Mark. We're going to sign off now. I want you to give me a positive. Let's end the show in good fashion.
I think the positive is Nick Valdemade. I think the fact that he is that kind of beacon of hope at the top end of the pitch, the fact that he is giving them an outlet, and he's the one being let down by those around him to an extent. But I think, look, there's still a lot to be positive about. I think you've got a big Champions League game coming up. Still in the Carabao Cup with a chance of that. Still the FA Cup to come down the line. There's a good run of fixtures coming up for Newcastle as well. It's really, really easy when you have a negative result to go too negative, and I think we've seen that with some of the outlets over the weekend. We've seen it with pundits over the weekend. It is a bad defeat. It's a poor performance. It's a blow-up performance. But we know this Newcastle United squad are good. We know that they're committed. We know they're talented. We know that they'll give everything. They will improve. Eddie's view there that you just played is perfect. He's looking at the bigger picture, and that's what everyone needs to look at. Look at how Eddie's looking at it, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Mark, for popping on to the show. Thank you to you guys for watching and listening. Me and Mark, hopefully, we'll be back on Wednesday celebrating victory for Newcastle United in the Champions League. And I agree with Mark. I think it's all going to click for Newcastle United. It's going to take a few weeks. It's going to maybe get worse before it gets better. But keep the faith. And if Eddie, you're listening, just sort out that gap between the defence and the midfield. Please. That's all I want for Christmas. Get it sorted. I'll be happy with no other presents. Until Wednesday, well, hopefully, like we say, we will be back celebrating victory. Look after yourselves. Watch out for the match preview with John Gibson later today. And I'll catch you, later today. See you in a bit.